Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Why is the state of New Hampshire such an active area for UFO encounters? How far back does it go as an active area? Are there connections with other paranormal activities there? Well, welcome to the 457th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. I'm Paul, and Ben has 2 more weeks left in the summer course he's taking, and that is also taking him away from the show on Monday evenings. But for now, let's get right to our guest. Ryan Mullahy has been studying the UFO phenomenon in the state of New Hampshire and in New England in general for over 14 years. In 2011, he founded New Hampshire UFO Research, which investigates, documents, and preserves New Hampshire's UFO history. The website is www.nhuforesearch.blogspot.com. I'll give him a chance to talk about that later. And it includes original articles on historic and current cases and up-to-date UFO news and sighting reports. Ryan has appeared on New Hampshire Public Radio, independent podcasts, and will be a speaker at the 2013 Exeter UFO Festival in, of course, Exeter, New Hampshire on August 31st. And feel free to call in this evening if you'd like. Give us a ring locally at 401-766-1240 or from anywhere in the U.S. or Canada, 800-449-1240. So, Ryan, welcome to Behind the Paranormal.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me.
That's a pleasure. Certainly, Ryan, the most famous New Hampshire UFO case of all time must be the Betty and Barney Hill encounter of 1961. For those who aren't familiar with that, that's the first alien abduction case, alleged alien abduction case, to receive national media attention. We've had their niece, Kathleen Marden, a good friend of mine, and other guests on the show several times to talk about that case, which took place near, of course, Exeter, and was the seed for today's Exeter UFO Festival. So what happened in that case, Ryan, if you could explain it for those who don't know about it?
Sure. Betty and Barney Hill were returning from a vacation in Canada with their dog Delcy, and they were driving through Lancaster, New Hampshire, returning to Portsmouth where they live. And Betty spotted a star-like object that caught her, attention, and she thought it looked a bit odd, so that drew her attention, and they were watching it as they drove through Lancaster, New Hampshire, and as they were driving on their route, they continued to be able to view the object, and they actually stopped at the Mount Cleveland parking area to observe the object. And then they continued on their way, and they got closer to the Indian Head area, Lincoln, New Hampshire area. And at that point, they were still able to see the craft, and they could see it a bit better. And at that point, they decided to stop the car on the road to get a better look. Barty got out with his binoculars. He was able to get a very close view through the binoculars of the craft and became very frightened at what he saw, and so got back in the vehicle, and they proceeded to start to leave the area at a high rate of speed. At that point, simultaneously there was a series of buzzing sounds as well as vibrations that coincided with those buzzing sounds. And the next thing they knew, they were about 35 miles further down their journey, and they just had a sense that something wasn't right. So that was the initial event that they had, and then after that, they just had the feeling that there was more to the situation. And after that, they sought the help of therapists and eventually underwent hypnosis to try and recall more of what they experienced.
That was several years later, right?
Yeah, I believe that was around 63, 64.
I think so, yeah.
When they actually went to a local Exeter, I believe, psychologist who then referred them to Dr. Benjamin Simon, who was part of the military's medical actual hypnosis program, and he actually treated people that were victims of World War II PTSD, and he used medical hypnosis to treat these people for that. So they were referred to him, and he was the one that conducted the hypnosis sessions for Betty and Barney.
Okay. And what was the result of the hypnosis sessions?
Well, the result was that they were hypnotized separately, and they gave their accounts of what happened, and basically a very exciting and interesting story was given where they were taken aboard a craft and they were examined and there was some interaction with the beings and then they were left back at their car.
Okay. This had, as I recall, some of the classic characteristics of an abduction case as we know it today, the missing time. Mm-hmm. This sort of thing. How many hours was it? I don't remember, between when they last remembered seeing the craft and when they were sort of back on the road?
Well, initially they didn't know exactly how much time. They just realized that when they got back to Portsmouth, it was already daylight was coming up, and they should have arrived back in Portsmouth when it was still nighttime. So that was the first indication that there was something off with the time. And then after the fact, when they started to, really kind of scrutinize closer the night and the course of events, is when they realized, I believe it's approximately 2 to 3 hours that is believed that might have been missing.
Okay. Very interesting. One thing that strikes me as interesting here is, well, in those days, as you know, Ryan, everyone who believed in UFOs assumed, and a lot of people still assume, when these are not explainable in any earthly way, that they're nuts and bolts vehicles from other planets. And indeed, I seem to recall in part of the Betty and Barney Hill case them seeing windows with people in the craft sort of looking at them or waving to them or something. I mean, yeah. Because I think that particular understanding is, and again, I mean, they were there and I wasn't. That's what our limited understanding kind of allows for, is a nuts and bolts craft from another planet. But we, now that we know or think we know more about the universe and indeed the multiverse, as you might say, we're hearing things like time travelers, space-time slips, interdimensional travelers, even spiritual entities. Now, with that in mind, what say you about cases like the Hills? Should they be reinterpreted?
Well, I think it depends on, everybody's individual interpretation of that case. I think that, like Jacques Vallée was one of the first ufologists to bring up the possibility of the connection between the paranormal and UFOs. And at the time, in 1969, it wasn't a very popular opinion with, the nuts and bolts ufologists. So I think that's something that over time, from the late 60s, I think that people have become more open to it. As far as my own interpretation of the Hill case, I try to keep a pretty open mind with UFO cases, and, I'm very open to the possibility that UFOs and other paranormal events could be connected.
Sure.
So I think it's good for people, to answer your question, to keep an open mind with things like this, and always leave it open for the possibility that they could be somehow connected.
Sure. Well, fair enough. I've always been intrigued by the buzzing sound that was reported. What do you think that might have been?
Well, it's interesting because the buzz, you mean the beeps that they heard?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, the beeps, like, as I said, they coincided with vibrations that were felt inside the vehicle, and these beeps were heard right as they were, taking off from the location where they were parked, and then they were heard again when they found themselves further down their route. One interesting thing is after this happened, one of the pieces of, physical evidence that was, viewed by people is there was a series of polished circles on the trunk of Betty and Barney Hill's car, and at the advice of somebody, Benny took a compass and placed it over these circles, and whenever she would place the compass over the circles, the compass would spin. So there were marks left on the craft, and Betty and Barney did seem to feel that those marks were somehow connected to these beeps and the vibration.
That's interesting. It's funny that you bring that up, because we bring a compass with us we being Ben and myself, on paranormal cases. And I've had it act in exactly the same manner in cases that supposedly have nothing whatsoever to do with UFOs. So again, possible parallels here.
Definitely.
Yeah. Now, also under hypnosis, I understand there came out stories of medical examination, the sort of thing, again, that you would associate with the classic UFO abduction experience. And also a star map. Can you tell us about the star map?
I know a bit about the star map. Betty after her examination was actually done sooner than Barney's, so she actually had a conversation with the being that she was dealing with, and she noticed that there was a map on the wall in the room and asked about it, and he discussed it a bit with her, and she asked where he was on the map, where his planet was, and he kind of funnily replied, well, do you know where you are on this map? And she said no, and he said, well, then you wouldn't be able to make any sense of what I told you. So there was a little exchange with that, and Betty was able to draw this map under hypnosis, and later on, a young lady named Marjorie Fish at the time, she took the map and started creating models of known star systems, and she felt that she found a match to the Betty and Barney Hill star map in a particular star system.
How far away? I don't mean to keep hitting you with things you might not know, but you got me interested here, of course.
Yeah, no, I don't know the exact distance. I know it's the Zeta Reticuli star system, which I believe is what she identified the map to match. I know that I don't know the distance off the top of my head.
I do, but I can't think of it right now. I don't know. Haven't been there lately. Ryan, in looking at your work, Ben and I were fascinated with the UFO flap that you report as taking place in New Hampshire in July 1947, the same month as the famous or infamous Roswell UFO crash in Roswell, New Mexico. Now, neither of us had ever heard of that flap in New Hampshire. What's that about?
Well, during that week, July, from July, I believe, 5th on, there were UFOs. There was a huge flap going on across the country and possibly the world. So there were things being spotted not in just Roswell, but all over the country. And during that week, there was a number of UFO reports made in New Hampshire, one of which, interestingly enough, was the son of then governor of New Hampshire, Charles Dale, and he was actually a military pilot and was flying with a friend and spotted a UFO while he was flying. So that was one report that came in on July 7th. And then also, July 5th. And then on July 7th, there was an interesting event where some metallic debris came down from the sky into a field in West Ringe, New Hampshire. Now, no UFO was sighted in this, but it's interesting because at the time, Project Sign, Project Grudge, or Project Blue Book haven't even started yet. So at the time, the FBI was investigating reports of this nature, and interestingly enough, this particular West Ringe case was part of the FBI's X-Files, which was actually a real thing. All of the things that were kind of outside of the norm for FBI investigation at the time would be labeled Security Matter X. So that's where the title for the TV show X-Files originates.
I didn't know that. Well. So the notion of the FBI investigating all this business, round about the late 40s, would you say that the government really did not know what was going on just yet?
It's hard to say whether they knew what was going on.
It's hard to know whether they still know what's going on. Whoever's behind this, if whatever is going on, I often wonder if the government isn't as much a victim as we are.
Yeah, it's really whenever anybody asks me that question, I get asked that a lot. What I've found just from, I try and base a lot of my research on declassified documents and things of that nature. And one thing that you find when you look at the declassified Blue Book documents, and also now the FBI has the Vault, which is all of their declassified UFO documents up online for people to view. Once you take a look at the sheer volume of documents that were once, classified dealing with these reports, you see that, the FBI was, at the time, they were taking it very seriously. They were looking into a number of cases. They were, top secret or confidential at the time. So it's hard to say what they know, but it's very telling that they were very interested and concerned, and they were putting a good amount of resources into looking into these sightings. So it's hard to say how much they knew, but they were very interested.
Well, having rubbed elbows with the intelligence community a little in my life, there was a concern at the time, of course, that these were Soviet and what kind of technology did they have? And, of course, during World War II, you had the so-called Foo Fighters, bombers over Europe of both sides would see these things, and the Germans thought they were Allied, and the Allies thought they were German, and nobody knew what was going on. And there are military records going back at least as far as the Civil War about strange sightings in the sky, right? And so, and of course, the whole UFO phenomenon goes back thousands of years. I mean, you got cave paintings, for heaven's sake, with these things. So it's not a new situation, but we often find, a frequent guest of ours, Frank Ficino, who was an expert, particularly on the Flatwoods monster incidents of 1952, he points out a similar pattern of UFO paths over the United States surrounding that incident. The green monster, supposedly the thing landed in the Flatwoods area of West Virginia, and the creatures were seen and this sort of thing. Ben and I have sort of think these are kind of tips of the iceberg involving everything from ghosts to UFOs. We've seen that in cases from Rendlesham Forest in England to our current project in central Connecticut. Most paranormal investigators don't look for patterns like that, especially when they might connect different areas of the paranormal. But I understand that some UFO researchers are taking that pan-paranormal approach, as you might say, more seriously. And I know you're not an investigator as such or a researcher, but have you as a researcher seen any trend in that direction? I know we've touched on it already. And do you have any thoughts on it beyond what you've said?
I think it's good for anybody, investigating UFOs or cryptozoology or ghosts. You want to look for patterns because, whenever you assemble data on anything, it's very important that the data be analyzed and, any things that, common factors, it's very important to, pay attention to those because that's going to be, the insights you're going to glean from the data that you're gathering. So, I think it's very important to, look for patterns, look for similarities and differences and contrasts when you're, examining any data of that sort. The only thing I can think of, other than what I had mentioned earlier, is one thing I did come across a few times in doing an article on the Great Airship Invasion in 1909, as well as that period of time in 1947, there was coinciding phantom panther sightings.
Interesting.
In the northern Massachusetts as well as New Hampshire area. Now, the ones that I found for 1909 were in the northern Massachusetts area, whereas the ones that coincided with 1947, and I think they went up to about 1952, those were in New Hampshire. And, at the time, from what I can gather, I haven't finished my research on that yet. It's something I've recently started working on, but it was quite a thing going on in New Hampshire at the time. There was a lot of sightings by credible people, so that's one connection that I've taken note of where there's such a drastic span of time from 1909 to 1947, and both of these UFO flaps had the Phantom Panther sightings as well. So that's one thing I can think of.
That's extremely interesting because I've done some research on that in New England, and I've written a few articles about it. And the Panther is one thing, but Bigfoot is something else. I mean, if whatever the cause of that may be, but the Panther thing in New England, Panthers or the eastern cougar used to be native, of course. And I have relatives who've seen them in their yard. I mean, they are back. There's so many deer. Where you have prey, there'll be predators. It's not just coyotes. It's these things are back. But in that period, that was very unusual. Was this a black panther, or were they black panthers? Or
well, it's as far as I'm trying to remember because I haven't looked at it in quite some time. But I believe they were described as there was a number of words used to describe because some people would call them cougars, panthers. So there's a lot of words sometimes used that all are kind of referring to the same thing.
Yeah.
But it was all basically descriptions of large black cats or dark cats that didn't appear native to the area. Well,
this is a little off topic, but I mean, UFOs are sometimes associated with the sightings of cryptids, as they're called, unexplained creatures. And I had just finished an article for a British magazine about which was studying the appearances of these large cats in England, to which they are not native, at least haven't been since the Ice Age or so. And I was reporting that the panther apparently was back in New England, even though the government won't admit it, because then they'd have to pay for it to protect it. But I was coming back through Burrillville, Rhode Island, right on Route 102 here, which our local listeners would know all about. It was dark. It was just after Christmas. It was December. And I saw run in front of my car, my whole family was with me, a black Panther. It wasn't very big, and it wasn't, but it was far too big for a domestic cat. And you know what you look for? You look for the tail. That tail sticking up in the, it's very, very distinctive. And sure enough, and they have been reported in Rhode Island, but with or without UFOs, I don't know. Okay, so let's sort of get back on our subject there. Now, I understand, Ryan, that there have been sightings of UFOs by the military and the police in New Hampshire. Can you tell us what was going on there?
Sure. There's been a lot of really excellent sightings, by police officers in New Hampshire, and one of the cases that is definitely not as well known as the Betty and Barney Hill case, but I think is equally significant, is the Incident in Exeter case, which happened in September 3rd, 1965, and that involved a young man having a UFO sighting. He was able to catch a ride to the police station and let them know about it. And interestingly enough, another officer on patrol had just left a woman that he had found parked on the side of the road who had claimed a red UFO was flying, dipping down at her car, and she was very distraught. So when, this young man, Norman Muscarello, came in and told the police, they may not have normally believed him, but because they had just had this other report that they dealt with, they took his report very seriously, and they knew him to be, a good kid who was no nonsense. So one of the officers returned to the field, which was actually in Kensington, New Hampshire, which is right outside of Exeter. He returned to the field with Norman, and at first they didn't see anything. They went out into the middle of the field, but when they got into the middle of the field, the UFO that Norman had seen, or a UFO, I'm not quite positive it was the same one, but we can assume, came over the trees and was right above them in the field, no more than a few hundred feet above them. And the field turned red. The officer and Norman were very scared. The officer dropped to his knee and pulled his revolver, but then grabbed Norman, and they fled to the cruiser because he was scared of radiation because of the red light that they were, enveloped in. So they ran to the police car. He radioed dispatch that he was seeing it too, and another officer who was already en route showed up moments later, and all three of them, witnessed this craft that then took off. So that's a very significant case because at the time it happened, 65 and 66 was another big UFO flap. And, at first Project Blue Book kind of tried to explain it away. There was a number of explanations that were offered up for the sighting. Stars and planets, the lights at Pease Air Force Base, a banner plane. There was a number of different things that were put forward, a refueling mission. But all of those things were proven to be false. And, one of the reasons why the case is so important is in 1966, Gerald Ford, he was having so many sightings in his district in Michigan that he actually called for a congressional hearing on UFOs. And Exeter was one of the key cases highlighted in those hearings. And, to the pleasure of the officers involved and Raymond Fowler, who was the key investigator, J. Allen Hynek and had to admit under oath that case was in fact an unknown, and it wasn't any of these other things that they had earlier explained it. So I think for that reason it's a very significant case.
Dr. Hynek being the Air Force's chief investigator at the time. Okay, we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back on Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM in New England's beautiful Blackstone River Valley with our guest Ryan Mullahy and UFOs of New Hampshire. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Russ Gorman. If you're concerned about 2013, relax. It's actually the 14th year of the 21st century, and a great time to get an astrological chart done. This year, I'm offering an added feature. I'm including lucky numbers on request with each chart or update at no extra fee. Discover what tomorrow will bring in regard to money, health, job, relationships, or possible windfalls. Call me at 401-333-4048 for information on getting your individual chart or update. Give your life a fresh start. Welcome the changes the planets are providing. I'm also available for private parties and speaking engagements for groups. Look forward to enjoying your future this year. Call me, Russ Gorman, at 401-333-4048.
ON Radio, ON Worldwide.
I wanted to just give you a word about USA Cares. That's one of the charities that Ben and I have adopted on both our shows. And USA Cares provides financial and advocacy assistance to post-9/11 active duty U.S. military personnel, veterans, and their families. There are never any fees or repayments, and the charity relies on donations from individuals and institutions. And they would like to start a chapter here in Rhode Island. All we need are 7 motivated people. The 3 main goals of the chapter, of course, fundraising, outreach, and awareness to military families in need. And if you'd be interested in helping to start this chapter, please contact me at paul@behindtheparanormal.com or 401-527-5345. Very good. Let's get back to our guest, Ryan Mullahy, and we're talking about UFOs over New Hampshire. I think we should point out at this point, Ryan, and you can expand on anything I might say here, that UFOs can be anything in the sky. We're not necessarily implying that all these things are alien craft or multidimensional time travelers or anything like this. I remember an incident down in Cumberland, Rhode Island, right in our listening area here when I lived there, and there was a large light that came right over, as a matter of fact, our house. And we lived in kind of an isolated area at the time, and a friend of ours saw it and called me at the Providence Journal, where I was an editor at the time, and knew I was into this stuff, and said, I saw a UFO over your house. This is not the sort of person who would hallucinate or a very serious feet on the ground type of person. So as it turns out, people all over the place saw this thing. And what it was a lighted advertising blimp without the advertising. And it was headed for the Hudson Valley to have, I guess, the lettering put on or whatever they were doing. But there were all kinds of UFO, people were pulling over and all this. So there were all sorts of explanations for these things. And but I think the cases you're talking about are ones that were examined for this kind of thing and were found to be unexplainable in any other way. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I think that's a great clarification that, UFO means unidentified flying object. It doesn't necessarily mean spacecraft or alien craft. I think, some of the cases that we're discussing, obviously Betty and Barney Hill, and even with the Exeter case, it's, there have been some people, that have tried to, say that it could be some sort of conventional craft as far as the incident Exeter, but, the quality of the witnesses in that case, they were both ex-military, they were both police officers, so, I think we should always assume UFO just means an object that can't be identified.
Right. Well, I want to get to this before, because we're burning up this hour very quickly. Great conversation.
Thank you.
This is from Alicia. It doesn't say where she's from, but comments that she recently discovered our show. And Alicia writes, being that you are in New England, I was wondering if you have done any research or have heard about any of the UFO experiences in the Franconia Notch area of New Hampshire. A lot of people are familiar with the story of Barney and Betty Hill, but I discovered when I lived in Littleton that many, many people have seen things in the skies as well as in the woods. I personally have had some odd experiences in the Sandwich Range. I'm not familiar with that, and I'm sure you are, and now avoid hiking there. Although I have been unable to find many other strange accounts of that area, so I may be getting creeped out over nothing. I'll stop there and let you... with the Franconia Notch area, given what we've said about flap areas like Rendlesham or Central Connecticut or whatever, I'm wondering if the Franconia Notch area, where the Betty and Barney Hill thing, as I understand it, more or less occurred. Have you heard anything about sightings? Would you call that an area where UFO sightings are common, or things in the woods, anything like that? Have you heard about any of that?
It is. It's surprisingly, there's been things, cited in that area all the way back to the Indians. And, that area, from what I've researched, there's been a lot of sightings in that area from people that are in the local campgrounds in the summer. So there have been, from what I've seen, there have been a number of reports, and, to what the person that waged the question, one phenomenon that I've seen a bit in New Hampshire is a phenomenon where a UFO isn't necessarily spotted, but some sort of glowing light is either spotted in the woods or on a mountain or a hillside in an area where there's no houses and where there shouldn't be any light. So that's a phenomenon that's been observed quite a bit in New Hampshire. And the Indians actually, observe that in that area as well as in Maine. So it goes for pretty far back, and there's been cases of that all the way up to recently in New Hampshire.
That's very interesting. It's funny, we just had Ted Phillips on a few weeks ago, and Ted is, for those of you who didn't hear the show, is I suppose sort of the Superman of gathering information on UFO landings and the physical traces thereof and physical evidence for this. And he has thousands of cases. And he's working with an area, he and other people are working right now in an area that they refer to as Marley Woods in Missouri. And that's not its real name, but that's a code name, I guess, or something, so people won't find out where it is. But he refers to precisely what you just talked about, lights in the woods and UFOs overhead, landings, and all this kind of thing. Rendlesham Forest. We took several pictures, Ben and I, when we were there, and which showed what I suppose would commonly be known in the paranormal world in the pop paranormal world as orbs, or these balls of light. They do seem to be kind of ubiquitous. In my opinion, which is, as usual, a minority opinion, I think these could be plasma-based life forms that were speculated about by astrobiologists and even Carl Sagan, that they apparently feed, in my experience, around the boundaries where things have sort of thinned out and things come back and forth through these electromagnetic boundaries between these what some physicists believe are parallel worlds. So, I mean, who knows? But I'm intrigued whenever I hear about these balls of light. What other recent cases have occurred in New Hampshire?
Well, there haven't been a whole lot of, kind of significant cases, that you could compare to, say, Betty and Barney Hill or the incident in Exeter. I would say recently. But, over the past few years, there have been a lot of, kind of orange light type things spotted in the sky in New Hampshire. There's been a lot of reports of that. But, nothing really that comes to mind of recent that's pretty major.
Okay, yeah, but, I'm thinking of Franconia Notch as we talk here, and so many UFO incidents seem to occur in mountainous areas. And of course, New Hampshire is very mountainous for our part of the country. The people in the West laugh and say, well, they're just hills. But nevertheless, one wonders about the seismic connections, if any, with some of these things. There have been experiments done with the so-called earthquake, trying to replicate the so-called earthquake lights that are sometimes seen when seismic activity is going on and just before earthquakes. But in the lab, and I've seen some of these experiments, they've only been able to create lights in the what would have been the sky, I guess, in the lab environment that last for only a second or two, whereas these things seem to act not only intelligently but also for quite some time in some cases. So have you noticed a lot of activity in mountainous areas in particular, or is that just coincidence?
No, I think that is a commonality. There have been a number of sightings near the Mount Monadnock region, which is the area I'm in, and there's a tradition all the way back to the 60s of up to present of things being spotted in that area, as well as, like we said, the White Mountains, Franconia Notch, the Lincoln area. There's been a number of things spotted there, so I definitely think that is safe to say. What the reason is tough. I can only theorize on that. With the White Mountain area, it's my theory. One of my theories on it is that when you're in an area like that, it's very easy for a craft to dip down in a valley and not only be visible to what's within that valley. As opposed to if you're up in the sky and there's nothing obstructing your view, people. So I think it could be. Maybe, for whatever reason, the remoteness of, the mountains in that region, but I could really only theorize on that.
One of the things that goes with the UFO folklore or fact, however you look at it, and I'm thinking of particularly of the things like the Mothman incidents in West Virginia that John Keel documented, that had a lot of other paranormal events going on at the same time, and that's the so-called Men in Black phenomenon. Okay, these people coming around and telling you not to talk about what you saw or asking you what you saw or whatever. Is there any of that in any of these New Hampshire cases going back, as far as you realize? Was anybody harassed by weird guys or anything like this?
Nothing Men in Black in nature that I've come across, although, in the incident Exeter case, Norman Muscarello, the boy that witnessed the craft with the other cops, him and his mother were visited by some military, and they said that they were told to keep their mouths shut about the event. There were also, this I haven't confirmed, but there was also a report that, the day after their sighting, it hit the paper pretty quick because when Norman came into the police station, the local reporter was there, so he got the scoop in the middle of the night, and he was able to get it into the next day's edition.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and there was a report of somebody from Pease that was going around trying to buy all the newspapers, so that now, whether that is true or not, I haven't been able to confirm that, but I always thought that was a very interesting story, to try and kind of damage control, how much of the story got out. But as far as actual Men in Black, I really, nothing, of the mysterious nature of the men in the black suits, nothing I've heard of, no.
Well, that's pretty good then, because they can be pretty scary, as I'm told, and I've talked to people who've actually seen them, supposedly. So I guess if you're going to see a UFO, New Hampshire's the place to do it.
Yeah.
Right. But speaking of Pease Air Force Base and places like that, have you uncovered particular activity around military bases? That's part of the UFO thing, that supposedly there's been some concern about them hanging around military bases, particularly if there are nukes. I'm not aware of any nukes at Pease, but who knows?
Oh, well, actually, very interesting on that. There's a very interesting Roswell Pease connection that Dean Merchant, who is actually the creator of the Exeter Festival, and he's also a New Hampshire ufologist and writer.
Yeah,
he's done some work on this, and basically Roswell, at the time of the UFO incident, was the home of the 509th Bomb Group, which is the most elite nuclear bomb group. They were the ones that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And interestingly enough, in 1958, the 509th Bomb Group was moved from Roswell to Pease Air Force Base.
No kidding, I didn't know that.
Yes, it was, and there was a number of sightings that were were made from Pease, some that involved both radar and visual confirmation. So that's a very interesting connection between Roswell and Pease that a lot of people don't know. So that's fairly significant, and where they were housing, the nuclear weapons at the time there, it makes it a very important location. So there were a number of sightings by military personnel.
Yeah, because we, concentrating on the Rendlesham case, Ben and I were over there last September, and we talked with several of the witnesses, or one of the witnesses, and we have done a lot on the air with that. The concern was the WSA, or the weapons storage area, which was not supposed to have nukes by treaty, but apparently it did. Mm-hmm. The thing came over, was shining beams down, and you can never get a full story out of this, but people like, would tell you that in some cases nuclear missiles were stolen somehow, transported out of the complex somehow when this thing was shining these beams down, or were deactivated, or in some cases the missiles were retargeted. And I know this isn't Rendlesham I'm talking about, this is in general. And I'm wondering, retargeted to where? And I've never been able to get that's kind of disconcerting in itself. I've never been able to get an answer on that, but we're still working on it. So very interesting about Pease. I never knew that. Going beyond things happening at the base there, have you ever uncovered in your research anything about clandestine activity by, whether it be the government or whoever is behind the government or whatever, whoever's doing this stuff with UFOs, if indeed such things are actually occurring, strange bases or anything like that going? Because I used to not believe that kind of thing myself until we ran into it ourselves in Connecticut. A lot of weird stuff going on. Anything like that ever turn up in any of these cases, or is it just sightings and the occasional abduction?
Yeah, nothing, no, clandestine bases or, anything like that. Like I said, I mean, looking over the Project Blue Book documents, over the years from 47 forward, it's obvious that there was a lot of military involvement in investigating, these cases that were reported in Exeter and around Pease. So there's definitely being investigated, but as far as clandestine, nothing that I've seen has alluded to anything clandestine.
Okay. Now, before we burn up the hour here, I want to give you a chance to talk about, first of all, your own website and your own work, and about the Exeter UFO Festival.
Okay.
And you're going to be speaking, I understand, there, and what are you going to be talking about?
Yeah, I'm actually going to be doing a lecture about the Exeter case.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, about 2 years ago, the Skeptical Inquirer released an article claiming to have explained the Exeter case. And the basis of my lecture is going to be, presenting data to show that is not the case.
Mm-hmm. That sounds interesting. I hope we'll be there to hear it. We usually attend. We'll see. It's funny you mentioned the National Enquirer. Oddly enough, during that case I'm always talking about on the air, in 1974 Bridgeport poltergeist outbreak, which I'd like to find out if there were any UFOs seen in the area at the time, because these were pretty alien beings, so to speak. The papers all over the world picked this up because the people I was working with didn't care what they said to the press and everything. It all went out. The only paper in the world that I saw that got the story right was the National Enquirer. You could have knocked me over with a feather. So I've always kind of had their stock kind of went up in my opinion. I later became a professional journalist, and I always say that, but don't be too sure what not to believe. I learned that in journalism. Anyway,
definitely, it was actually the Skeptical Inquirer that released the thing about the incident in Exeter. But to what you're saying, it's interesting because I've done a bit of research, and actually Tim Banal of America actually interviewed somebody that worked at National Enquirer during kind of the heyday back in I believe it was the 70s or whatnot. Mm-hmm. And from what I understand, they believe it or not, did pretty good investigations of things. As far as the UFO, obviously there was a lot of, things in the Enquirer kind of known as not a very credible paper, but there's another police UFO case from New Hampshire that happened in 1974, which is a very well-documented case, and the Enquirer actually ran an article on that. So I think you're right that, I think everybody has kind of, a certain notion about the National Enquirer, but the more I've, researched into it, it sounds like they actually did a pretty decent job of looking into these UFO cases.
Well, they certainly have their moments. But anyway, I've always noticed, Ryan, and this is my personal opinion, and maybe it's because we are relatively new to the UFO thing, and we only get into it because we had ghost cases that led right into UFO cases, because Ben and I spend years on cases, and I don't know if many other people do that, because the more you research it, the more you find, or others, cynics might say, the more you think you find. Anyway, mm-hmm. I've always found in general that UFO investigators are somewhat more credible than most ghost researchers. That's an arbitrary, perhaps, opinion on my part, but that's my impression. Mm-hmm. You still find, the feuds, the intrigues, the politics, reluctance to share information, but not as much as you do among the ghost crowd, in my opinion. Am I wrong about that, or is UFO research a mess too? Ufology is in kind of a tough spot, and I think you do unfortunately find a bit of that in ufology, and I think that stems from a lot of different reasons. I can only speak for myself. I've been researching UFOs for 14 years, and I've only been public with my research for the past 2 years. So for me, I tend to approach it with respect and humility, and so that's kind of how I approach it. But what you do encounter in ufology a lot is you can encounter people that aren't necessarily doing good research, or they're doing things for the wrong reasons, whether they want to be a UFO personality, or
they want attention or fame or whatnot. So I think that's where the problem can come in, where, when somebody's seeking that sort of attention because of UFO research, they're going to tend to be competitive about UFO research. So I think you run into a little bit of competitiveness. And then as far as sharing information, it's difficult because obviously, you want to share your research with people. That's part of the reason why you do it. But I think sometimes you get in a situation where there's other organizations that aren't necessarily doing good research and doing things and are kind of intently watching what other people that are doing good work are doing. And so you get into a situation where, it's not that you don't want to share information, but you also, you don't want other people just, coming along and co-opting what you're doing. So I think there's a bit of competitiveness, and I think that, everybody's in, whether it's ghost research or UFO research, everybody has a different reason why they're doing it. And I think, people... Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm listening to you describe this, and I feel like I could also be listening to a description of mainstream science.
Yeah,
but there is a difference with mainstream science. There is a certain academic discipline and peer review. For what they're worth, I think they are very valuable, but you don't have that seemingly in UFO research or paranormal research in general.
You're right, and that's something that's come up a lot in the past year, and I think peer research is a great idea, and, with any of the things that articles I do, my research articles, I give extensive references. I welcome people I want people to check out my work, I welcome that. But one of the problems you run into is what happens if your peers or the people, maybe that are UFO investigators in your general area, what if your peers, in that sense, maybe you're not, 100% about the quality of their work. So that's where the problem comes in is, if you don't feel you have peers that are of the quality that they should be judging your material. So I guess that's where I see a problem with the peer research. It's reverting back to what I just said, where there's competitiveness with some people. Peer research, I think, because of the competitiveness in ufology, it can be difficult, but I think it's necessary.
I see what you mean, Ryan. Yeah. Well, because that begs the question, what qualifies someone to investigate, as opposed to research, as you do, to investigate UFO cases?
I think, what should qualify somebody to investigate a UFO case is, and I've taken a look at the MUFON training manual, and, it's a combination of, scientific knowledge, knowing how to take samples, not contaminate them, how to approach different situations. If, like in the case of Ted Phillips, with like landing cases, you have to approach these things with caution. There's concerns about radiation, and, so I think people have to have a good grasp of science and, documenting things and preserving data and taking different astronomical, readings. And I think it's important that somebody have a grounding in that. But I also think it's important that those people, besides having that scientific background, they have a very good understanding of, the history of UFOs and what has come, beforehand.
Well, that sounds very sensible. So let's wrap it up on the note that what, in your opinion, is, I suppose, a garden variety UFO? I know that's a difficult question. Could be many explanations, as we said, but what, in your opinion, was the Betty and Barney Hill craft? And what about the ones that the police saw? Do you have an opinion on that? I know we're just speculating here, of course.
I don't. I guess my opinion on it would be that, it was some sort of, these were craft or phenomenon that appear to be, not in control by humans. But I don't like to go very further than that because, I try and, approach things from a center of gravity, and I try not to, I like to theorize, but, I'm not sure. It's a phenomenon that, is pretty compelling, but I wouldn't feel comfortable, taking a guess on it.
Well, that's fair enough. I will point out, though, that there is a book, and I wish I don't have it in front of me because I lent it to my cousin. I was very curious. Something like the Fire Officer's Guide to Emergency. It's present in every fire station and police station in the country, and it has an entire chapter on what to do if there's a UFO crash.
Oh, I'm familiar with this.
Yeah, and this is not some science fiction book. It's the common manual for particularly firefighters in situations where there are emergencies that could threaten a community. And for those who are skeptical about that, I mean, as we all should be to a certain extent, I think that probably gives some kind of a little bit of food for thought there.
Definitely.
So, Ryan, would you tell us once again when is and where is the Exeter UFO Festival 2013?
It's August 31st, 2013. It's going to be in downtown Exeter, New Hampshire, and it's at the historic Exeter Town Hall. And there's, it consists of lectures. I will be speaking as well as Richard Dolan and some other, great UFO speakers. And there's typically activities across the town. There's family activities as well as, food and different things going on.
Okay, very good. And I can testify on behalf of Ben and myself that it's a lot of fun. There are a lot of great people there. There are a lot of interesting things to see. All the merchants get involved in the neighborhood there, and it's just there's a little parade with the kids dress up. It's really a lot of fun, a lot of good food, a lot of interesting information. And well, Ryan, I want to thank you for being on, and maybe we'll see you up there. Ben and I for several years. Couldn't last year because we were in England, but this year we might be up there, and look for the CBS radio banner and Paul and Ben, and we'll be happy to. We usually record interviews and try and play them later on the air and all kinds of things, and we get to meet people who are interested in the subject. So, Ryan, again, thank you very much. We'll look forward, hopefully, to seeing you up there. If not, we might have you back on the show before that. We want to continue to promote it. It is a great event, and I understand the proceeds go to local charities.
Yes, the local Kiwanis has now taken over the organization of the festival, and they take the profits and they give to numerous local Exeter charities.
Excellent, very good. And just before we go, could you mention the other speakers right now? You said the Dolans are going to be there.
Yeah, Richard Dolan, Karen Dolan,
okay.
And then there's also Robert Schroeder, who's from Massachusetts, who's going to be speaking on UFOs, and also there's Jan Aldridge, who is from Project 1947, which is a really interesting group. They're working to help preserve UFO documents and UFO history through, collecting the files of different ufologists and whatnot. So, Jan's a very interesting, gentleman. I'm looking forward to hearing him talk a lot.
Excellent. Very good. And give us your website one more time, if you would.
It's www.newhampshireUFOresearch.blogspot.com.
Very good. Ryan, thanks for a very interesting conversation, and wish you a good evening, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks a lot, Paul. I had a great time.
Great, thank you.
Have a good night.
Okay, so many thanks to our producer, Steve Bianchi, a major theological figure here at ON. And next week, June 17th, the great Bill Burns of History Channel's UFO Hunters and publisher of UFO Magazine will be my co-host for an open-line show on the UFO subject. So get your UFO questions in now to Paul at BehindTheParanormal.com or use the question form at our show site, BehindTheParanormal.com. And on our CBS radio edition on Sunday, June 16th in Boston, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Windsor, and Seattle, Vancouver, and on radio.com, Ben and I will welcome 3 listeners of varying backgrounds to share their out-of-the-body experiences. Very good. All right, so we wanted to just tell you, of course, about my books, Footsteps in the Attic, Faces at the Window, Turning Home, God, Ghosts, and Human Destiny, and for those of you local folks, Rhode Island, A Genial History. You can get those all at the website, BehindTheParanormal.com, or our other site, NewEnglandGhosts.com, and check those out. And we leave you this evening with a thought from our dear old friend Albert Einstein. Concern for man and his fate must always form the chief interest of all technical endeavors. Never forget this in the midst of your diagrams and equations, unquote. I'm Paul Eno, and thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey. We will see you next time.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.